Hi everyone, my name is Maya. I'll be your anthropology instructor for this semester. And the reason I'm making this video, and it's quite possibly the only sort of lecture video that I'm going to make for you this semester, is basically because I feel like our readings for the first week and quite possibly for the following weeks kind of lack a little bit of context without a kind of lecture like this, because really I don't think that they do a great job of answering the question like, what is anthropology? What are we looking at? What are we doing here in this course? And, how do I approach these kinds of questions that we're looking at? So what is anthropology? It's the study of humanity. It's the study of people in a really broad sense. So anthro comes from the Greek word anthropos, meaning people, and logos comes from the Greek word, logi comes from the Greek word logos, meaning like logic or reason or explanation. So it's basically like anthropologists study people, we explain people, we try to find the logic and reason behind people, humanity, and what we do. So for this course and for American anthropology in general, we basically take a four-field approach, we call it. So anthropology is the discipline, and then we have four sub-disciplines. So it's cultural anthropology, linguistic anthropology, biological anthropology, and archaeology. And so after our first week where we talk about cultural appropriation and ethnocentrism and cultural relativism and a little bit of the history of anthropology, each of our 4 weeks will be divided into studying each of the four subdisciplines, which is a pretty traditional way to approach the subject of anthropology for an introductory course in North America anyway. If you go to Europe, you find that archaeology tends to be under its own departmental heading, and it kind of is considered a little bit of a different thing from anthropology. So for the four fields, we have cultural anthropology, which is the study of people from the perspective of their cultures or societies. And we'll get into a little bit more about what culture is later on. But for now, just kind of take it as whatever idea you have of what culture means in your head, that's probably what we study. There's linguistic anthropology, which is the study of people from the perspective of our human languages and how these affect and are affected by culture is often a big part of what they study. Biological anthropology is the study of people from the perspective of our biology, our human biology. So this includes topics like biomedical anthropology, forensic anthropology. I'm sure you all know what that is, the study of disease in human populations, and also primates. So if you think of Jane Goodall going to the jungles and studying chimpanzees, Jane Goodall is a primatologist, but she would also, in a sense, be considered a biological anthropologist because primatology does fall under that category. And then archaeology, of course, is the study of people from the perspective of our material culture and the study of our past. And so archaeologists do things like excavation, and they use other tools in order to kind of try to learn about our past populations. And really, they mostly do that through our material culture. So archaeology, to get into a little bit deeper, as I said, it's a study of our material culture and of our past. So you probably have a sense of archaeology that they go out into the field, they do digs, they do excavations, they use their little trowels. And that is a lot of what a lot of archaeologists do, but it's not always like super encompassing of the field. They do have a lot of other non-invasive tools besides excavation, such as, for example, ground penetrating radar. So that's a really common way of studying archaeology, and it's basically a machine that goes over the ground and it uses radar to see what's below the surface and to see kind of what's down there. So you don't always need to excavate. It's not always appropriate to excavate, but archaeologists can often still kind of see what's down there. And some archaeologists don't do excavations at all. They don't even necessarily study the distant past as you may associate, like the kind of archaeology that would bring you to the Middle East or to the Aztec or the Incas. So some archaeologists actually study the historical field. So just as an example of that, kind of a famous archaeology method that you might hear about is the study of garbage dumps. So it's called garbology. So some archaeologists don't need to really study any sort of ancient human population or distant past human population. They might just go into your local garbage dump and do an excavation and look at like, what is it that people throw away? What did people throw away in the past? How is what we throw away different than what we throw away in the past? And what does that tell us about this population? They might study at places like historic sites, like the kind of places that you could visit on a school field trip, or if you're just a particular history buff. There are even projects that archaeologists will do that study like contemporary material culture. So one example of that would be that there have been archaeologists who study homelessness by investigating the sites of campsites of people who are unhoused. So they can learn a lot about what's going on with people today through traditional archaeological methods. And in terms of careers, if archaeology is something that interests you, many archaeologists are employed in something called cultural resource management, or CRM, as you might often hear it called. And so they are the people where I'm sure you've heard of, if you're doing, like if you're building a big building, or if you're doing some work on your house and you find something and you're like, is this an artifact? And then you have to call in an archaeologist to come and investigate. That's cultural resource management. And I know a number of people who work in it. It seems like there's work in cultural resource management if it's something that interests you. So biological anthropology. Biological anthropologists work in all sorts of fields as well. It's a really all-encompassing discipline. So it's the study of humanity through biological terms, through our human biology. And often it's also the study of human evolution. So some biological anthropologists study other living primates like apes, monkeys, and lemurs, who are our closest living relatives. Other biological anthropologists study our closest non-living relatives, like hominins, such as Neanderthals and Lucy the Australopithecus, and all of these sorts of things. You might have learned about it a little bit in high school, but biological anthropology is where you would want to study if that's kind of what interests you. And then biological anthropologists also don't necessarily work in this sort of human evolution field, but they can often work in medical anthropology, which can often be kind of a combination of cultural anthropology and biological anthropology. But for example, I know somebody who studies race-based disparities in health and healthcare. That's something that a biological anthropologist might be concerned with. And in that case, they would be looking at often like biomarkers and blood samples and that sort of thing. Some biological anthropologists study genetics, and so they work to understand humanity through genetics as a methodology. They might be looking at human evolution or epigenetics or population genetics, but that's sort of the lens through which they work. And biological anthropology also includes forensic anthropology, which I want to say is probably the most famous kind of anthropology. There are numerous television programs that cover biological anthropology in depth. And if you've ever spent a lot of time listening to true crime podcasts, I'm sure you've heard the subject of forensic anthropology come up. But the forensic part of forensic anthropology means that really it's the legal application of the study of human remains. So a forensic anthropologist might be asked to give an opinion on the circumstances in which somebody was found deceased, or they might be even asked to give an opinion about the way that somebody died or the types of injuries that they had at the time of their death. Linguistic anthropology is a really neat field, in my opinion. It covers the study of language, but not necessarily through a strictly linguistic perspective. So there might be some overlap between a linguistic anthropologist and just a plain linguist in the kinds of work that they do. But a linguist might study their entire career just looking at like syntax, or I don't know, this English syntax or something like that. Or linguists might actually just spend their entire career studying like the way that tongue movements work. But linguistic anthropologists often tend to have a bit of a more cultural sort of focus when they're looking at language. So a lot of what a linguistic anthropologist might do is like uncover the ways that culture and language intersect, and how cultural concepts, just as one example, politeness, are rooted in our language, and they may actually lead to things like cultural misunderstandings. So just to give you one quick example, between British and American English, it has to do with politeness, what's called positive politeness versus negative politeness. So in the United States, positive politeness tends to be more like, how do I say this? It's more like you're coming up to somebody and you're immediately very friendly, even if you don't necessarily know somebody. You know, you're quite friendly to a shopkeeper or just to somebody who you've met briefly. You might ask them things like, how are the kids? You know, how are you doing? Do you need anything? I love your bag. And negative politeness tends to be, positive politeness, you're kind of like putting more out there of yourself, and that's what makes it positive. But with negative politeness, you're kind of keeping yourself back a little bit. You're more reserved. And so that's what makes it a negative politeness. And not that those are judgment terms, negative and positive, that's just where they're coming from. So it often leads to misunderstandings where when American people visit England, they say, oh my goodness, everyone was super rude there. And when British people visit America, they might say, oh my goodness, everyone was super rude there. And it's not that either culture is more or less rude, it's just that they have different ways of showing politeness. Anthropologists might also look at how language reflects really just the reality of like how as human beings we move about our lives and we just exist in the place that we exist, in the culture that we exist. So one example that I remember learning about was cardinal directions compared between Gugu Yimithir. I don't think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I couldn't find the correct pronunciation for it, so I do apologize. But it's a language that is from an Indigenous group that is Indigenous to the far north of Queensland, Australia, versus English, where they compared how cardinal directions in English are like north, this won't translate because I think this will flip my image, but north, south, east, west. So you might say, okay, you're going north from here, or the store is on the south side of Princess Street, or okay, I think we need to turn east at the next corner. But with this language, Gugu Yimithir, their cardinal directions are actually quite a bit more specific. And so it might reflect the reality that, for example, like people just need to be more specific in their directions in this language. And so the language actually has tools that go far beyond like north, south, east, and west. And they actually have specifiers in their language that can give you a much more detailed idea of where exactly it is that you're talking about when you're giving directions or where you're explaining where something is. And so English versus Gugu Yimithir, very different worlds, right, of the people who speak these languages. And so because of that, their language reflects these different worlds. So sociocultural anthropology, I saved for last because it's probably the most relevant to what I'm going to talk to you about for the rest of the day. And it's a little bit what's the most relative for your readings for this week. So sociocultural anthropology is also called social anthropology or cultural anthropology. I feel like when I'm talking about it, I tend to say cultural anthropology, but sociocultural anthropology is the broader term. And it's basically the study of human culture and societies, and also like our practices and our situations that we just really what we do as people, right? So it's a really wide-ranging field. And in the olden days of anthropology, the expectation for like a PhD student in anthropology would basically be that you would go off and you would venture off. This is true for both American and European anthropology. And you'd visit an Indigenous culture that's fairly unknown to European and American society. And while you're there, you would conduct an ethnography. And this is the main research method in sociocultural anthropology. So it involves something called participant observation, which is you're really participating in something while you're observing it, right? And the ethnographic portion really means, like, to get to the root of the word, it means to draw or to write a culture. And so while you were in this culture, you would try to understand everything about them, right? You would all of these different components of culture, marriage, death, kinship, religion, you would find out about all of these things. You'd participate in all of these things in order to get the best understanding that you could about all of these things. And then you would go home and you'd write a book about it. And you'd write all of these different parts of the culture. You'd articulate them into a book, basically. And so I'd like to think that cultural anthropology has moved past that. So nowadays, if you were to go into cultural anthropology, if you were to continue your studies in anthropology, you would probably be asked not to look at a culture so much. Like you wouldn't be asked to look at the Gabusi culture, for example, which an anthropologist named Bruce Noft wrote about. You'd really be looking at, in the best way I can explain it, a situation. So we live in a very globalized world. The situations that anthropologists study are not always going to involve just one culture. So it's going to be pretty impossible to try to write it down in those terms, right? So for example, I know an anthropologist who works on the United States-Mexico border, and their ethnography is about migrant experiences. So you can see how in that sort of situation, it might be difficult to go into there and ask, what's the religion of this situation, right? Because it's not the same thing. It's not what we used to do as cultural anthropologists. And so in my research, which is considered economic anthropology, or the anthropology of money, which is like a sub-discipline of anthropology, I am looking at pension funds. And my research, I'm currently interviewing unionized teachers about how they feel about their union's pension fund and their investment practices. Because really, the sort of situation that I'm looking at is that pension funds are these like really big corporations, right? They're these big firms, these big funds, and they're tasked with investing money that will come back in or come back to the people who are investing in that pension fund in their retirement. And so there's really an inherent tension about like the ideas there, right? Because pension plans, on one hand, are this really leftist part of the social welfare system. They're really considered kind of part of the social fabric, at least in Canada, where we have a national pension plan that every worker buys into. But on the other hand, pension funds are investing in some shady things. I'm just going to say it, some shady things, right? They're investing in shady companies with shady labor practices. And so how do we really reconcile the fact that some privileged workers who have a great working life, they have a great retired life, and they get all of this because their pension fund is investing in companies where people don't get that, right? It's sort of exploitative in a really fundamental way. So that's kind of where my research is. And you can see how that is a situation rather than it is a sort of culture, right? So what is culture? Good cue. Culture is a really uniquely human phenomenon that basically describes the way we live and the way that we organize ourselves, and really everything that we do as people, the practices that we do, the traditions that we have, the ways that we group ourselves, the things we believe, the things we say. Culture includes all components that are considered universal or near universal to humanity. And that is components of our cultural life that include things like marriage, families, kinship systems, genealogies, religion, economics, and subsistence. Subsistence really means the way that you acquire goods as a society. So the way you subsist, including food at its most basic. So you can see how acquiring food and acquiring essential goods is kind of, it's not the same thing as economics necessarily, but it is kind of the same thing in terms of what economic anthropologists study, because a lot of economic anthropologists, at least in the past, would study subsistence specifically. Politics, political organization, rites of passage. So rites of passage basically mean when you go from one phase of life to the next. So that includes birth, becoming an adult, marriage, having children, death, all of these things are considered part of culture. It's a really abstract concept. And what I wanted to just kind of give a quick mention to is that often in an introductory anthropology setting, and I think probably also just in the way that people talk about anthropology, and so that's why I wanted to mention it, is just because what you might have heard about anthropology might be a little bit different to what anthropologists actually study and practice. So culture is sometimes considered to be separate to language and separate to nature. I've heard it described as being opposed to both of these things. Like you have your language and you have your culture. You have your culture and you have nature, right? Nature being the natural world. So this isn't really correct at all. Languages are inherently tied to cultures, and the two things really influence each other. You might have even considered, the fact that when you were probably a small child, you would have heard different slang terms than you hear now in your own language, right? And those are reflective of our culture. So our language changed to reflect our culture. And then our culture also really leans on our language in some ways. There are some aspects of our language that, I'm sure you have heard bigoted people point to our language as being the reason why people can't use they, them pronouns, just as one example. So, language and culture are really intertwined in a way that it's really hard to parse the two things in terms of concepts. The natural world is kind of also sometimes opposed to culture. And you may have heard certain narratives where people will say things such as that the natural world gives rise to certain cultural practices, or it's our culture that's doing this to nature, or our nature is changing and that will change our culture in some way. And all of these things are true, but where it becomes a little bit problematic to talk about these two things as being separate is, for example, that humans really influence the natural world just inherently, just by being in it. And so it's kind of an interesting, just an interesting thing. So it is true that the natural world will influence the way that people practice their culture and will certainly give rise or limit even the ways that people can practice their culture. So if you are talking about a group that lives in the far, far north of the world, their culture inherently will have to be a little bit differently, or be done a little bit differently than the people who live in the far, far, well, actually, now that I think about it, far north and far south are not that different. So far north, and let's call it the equator. Those are very different environments. And of course, people who live there are going to have to adapt to that natural environment in a certain way. But what I mean to say is that interchange isn't exactly one way. So the nature influences culture, cultural influences nature. And really, after a certain point, it often becomes hard to distinguish like what is culture and what is nature. And I'm just going to give one example here, which is the Gary Oak Meadows and camas production. So this is an example of an ecosystem from where I'm from, on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada. It is a beautiful ecosystem. And if you look at the photograph that I provided, it is like a beautiful, natural, like heavenly paradise. They're so gorgeous. But, and the Gary oak is a super endangered species. There's not that many of them. There's not that many Gary oak meadows that still exist. And when we hear that kind of narrative, you may think like, oh no, darn, like we've built too many suburbs over natural environments. We polluted too much. But the thing is that the Gary oak meadow, while it is an incredibly important ecosystem, it provides habitat. It really is a part of the natural world of Vancouver Island if you're going to distinguish between nature and culture, but it is not natural in the sense that it never existed just solely and never proliferated anyway, just solely as like its own thing. In fact, the Coast Salish people, and I use that as a broad sense because different groups did this on Vancouver Island, but the Garry Oak Meadow was made intentionally by Indigenous communities by burning portions of land strategically and in a controlled way, because they knew that after it was burned, the species and the ecosystem that would populate that burned land was a Garry Oak Meadow. And it wasn't just, so the Garry Oak is what's considered endangered now, but the reason that they did this was not to like sustain the Garry Oak in some way. It was because of camas production, because they knew that if they burned this land and the Garry Oak Meadow came in, that it would be really important for camas, which was an incredibly important food source for these groups. And so this purple lovely flower that you see here is all camas. And I've seen camas like not in the Garry Oak Meadow setting, but how do you get a lot of them to grow in one place? It is 100% by creating a Garry Oak Meadow through strategic burning. So you can look at the natural environment and you can look at culture, and you could look at these two things as separate, but often that's not really even the case, just because people are so intensive on the land that we live in just by virtue of being there. What is society? So society forms the in sociocultural anthropology. Society is, in a broad sense, it means the way that we organize ourselves as human beings, which is also, if you'll remember, that's what I said culture is. But the concept is important for cultural anthropology and for archaeology, kind of society. And so we tend to look at different kinds of societies in anthropology. Actually, we don't do that so much anymore. We used to look at different kinds of societies in in anthropology. And we also used to type them into broad categories, ranging from less complex to more complex. And when I talk about complexity here, what I mean is not a judgment about like how much a culture knows how to do or something like that, because often that's what people tend to think of just because of how we use complexity in our daily lives. But what I'm talking about with complexity essentially is how many layers and steps there are in a society. And that might not mean a lot to you, but I'll just give an example. If you're living in a foraging society in an area that this works, you could subsist, you could get your food by going out and foraging. But in our incredibly complex, industrialized, super industrialized society, what you might be looking at in terms of subsistence is, okay, so let's start with Monsanto. You have the Monsanto Corporation. The Monsanto Corporation has shareholders. The Monsanto Corporation sells seeds to farmers. Farmers buy those seeds, they plant them, they water them. Maybe they don't water them even with an irrigation system that's rooted locally. They might water them with water from like several states away. But the farmer waters their crops, they harvest them. They might use labor for this, they might not. They sell their crops to a different corporation that has different shareholders. That corporation makes xanthan gum, and that corporation sells xanthan gum to a subsidiary of their corporation, which makes chocolate bars. And those chocolate bars get shipped across the country in big old trucks that pollute a lot, and they go to your local convenience store. And you, the consumer, you have to go to your job to make money, and your job might be any number of things. You might own shares in Monsanto. Maybe you do. Maybe Monsanto gives you dividends, and you use that dividend money to go to your convenience store to buy a chocolate bar. That's what I'm talking about with complexity, right? There's just so many layers to anything that we talk about. It's never truly as simple in our society as, oh, I'm just going to go to the store and buy a chocolate bar. And then you have to get into like, what is money, which is beyond the scope of this course. But if you're interested, I'm teaching a course later this summer. We'll talk about what money is. Anyway, So these different types of societies that we come up with, complexity is part of it. And then they're often also associated with different subsistence strategies. So as I mentioned, this is our way of getting goods, of getting our essentials. And social stratification, which means the way that goods and status are distributed hierarchically across a society. So this might be through a class system. This might be through the lack of a class system. It might be through a class system like ours that has tons and tons of different layers, wherein, we can talk about working class, we can talk about the upper lower middle class, we can talk about the upper class, we can talk about the billionaire class, right? We just have so many different classes. It's so stratified, right? The richest of our rich are just so incredibly rich, and the poorest of our poor are so incredibly poor. So we are in an incredibly stratified society. The way goods and status, sorry, I'm just reading over what I just said, as well as political organization. So we'll talk about what that means. So historically in anthropology, we tended to group different categories into these four categories, which I stole from an anthropology textbook, but don't worry, I put the description in my own words. So bands are considered to be small groups. They're often nomadic. They rely on foraging. Sometimes foraging is called hunting and gathering. I don't like that description. I just like to call it foraging. They're often very egalitarian, which is kind of the opposite of stratified. So you have stratified on one side and egalitarian on the other side. It basically means people are pretty equal. They're on pretty equal footing to one another. And in particular, genders are pretty equal, right? There's not as much difference in power between men and women. And their politics often preclude one person or small group of people from being in charge. So rather than one person or one group being in charge, power tends to be shared pretty equally, which is part of what it means to be egalitarian. Tribes are larger than bands. They rely more on horticulture and agriculture for subsistence. I don't think you don't have to know what horticulture is, but what it means is, and it's kind of a nonsense distinction, but it basically means instead of agriculture, which is considered more intensive, it means that you are changing the natural environment in some way in order to increase the production of food. So you might call Gary Oak Meadows something like horticulture. Tribes are egalitarian, but they have more formal political and kinship organization. So they might have particular families or kinship or clans or something to that effect that do have kind of a more distinct political relationship than just families. Chiefdoms are larger still in terms of population. And then chiefs have a chief who is in charge. And the chief is often a hereditary position. Chiefs have higher status and social stratification is more evident. And then they also tend to be agricultural as opposed to horticultural. So it might involve things like clearing land and irrigation and more distinctive like selection for crops, just as one example. States are very large groups of people. We live in states. Intensive agriculture is required for subsistence. So this isn't just agriculture. This is agriculture that we are super selecting our crops. We're getting tons of irrigation in there. And then we also in states see a central political structure. So basically a government with written rules and laws that are enforced. Now, I bring these up to tear them down. What is the problem with this? Societies don't really exist in neat boxes like this. It's not really helpful, typically. If we think back to the Gary Oak Meadows that we just learned about, are the Coast Salish people who made them practicing a form of horticulture? I would say so. However, I have heard, including in some classic anthropological texts, Coast Salish groups described as hunter-gatherers or foragers, as I like to call them. But still, they influence the land drastically to increase food production. And I would argue that you would be extremely hard-pressed to find any society anywhere on Earth that doesn't really drastically influence their land to increase food production. So when do we call that foraging? When do we call that horticulture? When do we call that hunting and gathering? That's what, I don't know. But even when we look at contemporary structures of political organization in these communities, it's often common to have both a hereditary chief and an elected chief, at least in West Coast British Columbia, where I'm from. But some of these organizations are colonially imposed structures called bands. That's in Canada, we forcibly moved people onto reservations, and then at some point we called them bands, and then we basically imposed an elected democratic political structure on them wherein they elect a chief. But in many communities, they have an elected chief, and then they still have somebody who's a hereditary chief, and both of these people are considered chiefs, and they don't always agree on things necessarily. So are we going to argue that all of these Coast Salish groups are bands? Because that's what our government likes to call them, but many of them have chiefs, many of them have two chiefs. So are they chiefdoms? What if they don't practice the more intense agriculture associated with chiefdoms? Does that make them not a chiefdom? You know, many communities in what's now coastal British Columbia had chiefs, and they had pretty serious political organization, but often anthropologists tend to look back at them and call them bands because they lived in smaller groups and they didn't practice as intensive agriculture. Or they didn't practice agriculture, but they did work the land. So really all of this comes down to what is called ideal typing. So there's a sociologist named Max Weber. Many of you have probably heard of him, but he came up with this idea of what he called the ideal type in social sciences. So Weber said that social science is made up of very abstract constructs that are hard to categorize. My apologies, I'm having trouble speaking today, which is true. We absolutely have these crazy abstract constructs that we come up in social sciences. And the science part of our discipline kind of doesn't like that to be quite as free-floating as maybe it often ends up. And so a lot of social scientists throughout our history as a discipline have tried to create these categories in which to fit really complicated things into neat little boxes. And so a lot of times in social sciences, we wind up with these ideal types. And these are categories that exist only really in relative terms, right? So we can't look at a society and call it a band unless we have other societies to compare it to, which we consider to be tribes, chiefdoms, or states. So they're really only useful in terms of comparison from one thing to another. But I bring this all up to say that despite what's often taught in these introductory anthropology courses, I just want to really make the point that today in anthropology, anthropologists who are currently practicing really strive to go beyond these sort of traditional categories that exist in social sciences and in anthropology in particular. Today, we don't love so much to just talk about, break our cultures down into marriage and kinship and political organization and economics and sort of describe them that way. We really aim to describe things in terms of a situation, but for the longest time in anthropology, maybe not so much at the beginning of anthropology, but the goal is basically to describe things on their own terms. So if I were tasked today, and Lord knows I wouldn't be, but if I were tasked to go and to create an ethnography of a Coast Salish community, it wouldn't be my goal to decide whether they fit into each of these types of societies, because who cares, right? My goal is to describe a situation or a group or whatever you're ending up studying on its own terms. So before I get into our next category, to talk a little bit more about culture, These are some of the features that are often listed when we talk about culture. And I think they're pretty useful in terms of just getting like a real grasp on like what is culture. So culture is learned through a process called enculturation. What this means is that as little babies, we are not born into any particular culture. I mean, we might be, our parents might be of a particular culture, but how we learn culture is called enculturation. And it's basically the process of growing up, right? Through growing up, we learn culture, and we learn it from whatever culture is being practiced around us. There's no biological component to culture that says just because your parents might be of a certain heritage means that you will always have aspects of that certain heritage. If you're raised in a different culture, you're probably like, no, you will, you will grow up in that culture. And so the culture that you learn will have nothing to do with your biological parents, regardless of what their heritage is or what their culture is. Culture is shared. I put a note, but not totally, because there are always subcultures and countercultures. But the important thing is that culture is shared between different people within a group, right? You can't just be a human person, an individual, and you're going to decide that you're going to create your own culture. And you go down the list of the different components of culture and you say, this is how marriage and family is going to work in my culture. And this is how we're going to do our rites of passage. This is how we're going to conduct funerals in my culture. And this is how we're going to organize politics in our culture. And here's how I want my economic system to work. And then just expect that anybody else is going to share your culture. That's not really a culture. That's just something that you made up. And maybe that's fine if you're writing a fantasy novel or a sci-fi novel, but it's not a real culture. That's not what culture is. Culture is something that really is fundamentally just shared between people. And as to what a subculture and counterculture is, if you've taken any sort of sociology course, you've probably heard these terms before and gone into more depth about it, but basically means a group of people within the dominant culture. And within, I mean, you know, not just that they're living next to the dominant culture, but they're part of one culture, and they kind of break off a little bit and they say, we're different in some way. They have different practices, different traditions. For example, I live next to a house that is an anarchist collective. And so the anarchist collective is absolutely a counterculture, because they say, we're not going to vote because we don't believe in democracy. We don't believe in government. We believe in anarchism. That's our foundation. So that's a counterculture, because they totally, you know, disavow this really big part of how society works here in my town in Canada. But also, they are part of the Canadian culture, right? They understand things, you know, it's not that they are ever going to have a really horrible cultural miscommunication that would occur between me and them, because fundamentally we understand each other's cultures and we understand where each other are coming from. They just have a big difference in how they see the world and how they practice culture, really. Culture is symbolic and symbols are arbitrary. So what does that mean? Culture is symbolic. A lot of times what that's referring to is pretty much our language. So our language is super symbolic, and I guess with the exception of onomatopoeias, we have these symbols and they don't really like mean anything inherently. It's not like you say cat and everyone across the world would understand, oh yeah, cat. Yes, of course it's called a cat, because you could call a cat and I'm stealing this is a kind of a classic example of when we're talking about symbolism and culture, but you could call a cat a gork and it wouldn't make any difference. It wouldn't be English. It would certainly take really something for the word gork to replace the word cat in English, but it would make about as much sense as calling a cat a cat. Now, I guess you could say that onomatopoeias are maybe a little bit more universal because we say that a cat says meow, and other cultures might say that a cat says mew, or a cat says, I don't know, I can't think of any. But there are, if you've learned a language other than English, it's kind of always fun for me anyway to look at their words for like, what does a cat say in this language? And it always makes sense intuitively. Like you're like, oh, okay, yeah, a cat says mew, sure. But it's just a slightly different language, or it's like a slightly different interpretation of that word than we have in English. Because it's not a word, it's a thing that cats say. Culture is integrated. So to look at how this works in the United States and kind of as an example, means that cultures can be integrated with one another, right? You can have different cultures, different groups of people from different cultures living together, and they don't necessarily have to share the same culture, right? You certainly know people from a different cultural background than you do, and maybe you're from a different cultural background than the dominant one in the United States, but your cultures can exist within the United States and they can exist alongside the dominant culture, and there may be some adaptations that happen where you learn aspects of the dominant culture in order to communicate with the people of the dominant culture. But what makes it integrated is that you still preserve your own culture. That group still preserves its own culture. Culture is adaptive. So there are kind of two ways that adaptive gets used in anthropology, and I will distinguish between them. Biological adaptations are kind of minor physiological changes that happen when a group of human beings lives in a certain environment for a particular time. And often it's an environment that's a little bit difficult to live in. So just as one example, in a super high altitude where the oxygen levels aren't high, and you might adapt temporarily when you visit a high altitude environment, but populations that live there long term tend to have these really minor adaptations where you might, for example, have a larger chest cavity, or your blood might simply carry more oxygen to your cells. But cultural adaptation means that we basically adapt, we make cultural adaptations in order to overcome these same sorts of problems. So if you're living in an Arctic environment, there might not necessarily be a biological adaptation for your group, but you might adapt by learning to hunt animals. I mean, yeah, the group might adapt by hunting animals that have a particularly thick fur and then using those for clothing. So that would be an example. And then that becomes your traditional clothing. It becomes part of your culture. So that's what I mean by cultural adaptation, as opposed to biological adaptation. Culture is dynamic. Really, I'm sure you can guess what this means. Cultures change. Cultures are constantly changing. You can't stop a culture from changing. That's what they do. So there are a number of different ways that this happens. The first is called diffusion. So there are different ways for diffusion to happen as well. We love in anthropology to categorize things, don't we? So what we mean by direct diffusion is, let's say you have culture A, culture B, and culture C. They live on 3 islands, one next to the other. They all have totally different cultural backgrounds somehow. But direct diffusion would happen when culture A trades with culture B. So people from culture A meet up with culture B. They exchange goods. Maybe the goods are something that changes the culture. Maybe it's just the meeting of the other culture, that brief interchange of ideas, but they become slightly different from communicating with each other. Indirect diffusion would be culture A trades with culture B trades with culture C, and then culture B trades some of the goods back from culture C into culture A, and maybe also some ideas. Maybe at these meetings of exchange, they're not just exchanging the goods from culture C, but some of their ideas that they've learned from culture C, some of their ways of life. And so even though culture A has never traded with culture C, maybe they have some of the goods from culture C, maybe they learn some techniques from culture C, maybe they learn some ideas from culture C, even though nobody from culture A has ever met anyone from culture C. And then we also have forced diffusion, which really means when a dominant group tells another group, you are going to be more like us now. And that's really related to the idea of assimilation, not necessarily to acculturation, but you may have heard the term forced assimilation. So forced diffusion basically means forced assimilation, but assimilation doesn't necessarily have to be forced, although that's often, that's the situation that we're often talking about when we talk about assimilation. But assimilation really means that often it's a smaller cultural group, but that people from one culture end up interacting with people from a different culture, and they end up just completely adopting the other culture. I'm trying to think of an example that might not be forced. There's the Roanoke colony, where I just learned about this actually because I'm not American, but it's one of the first European settlements in America. There was a group of like 150 people, and somebody left, and then they came back and all those people were gone, and everyone was like, where did they go? Did they vanish? But one of the theories is just that they moved in with a local indigenous group and basically just like stopped having their European culture, and they're like, okay, I guess we'll be like you guys now. And that might have been forced, it might not have been, but that's what we kind of mean by assimilation, is they became so assimilated with that culture that nobody knew where their settlement had gone, if that's what happened to them. And acculturation is kind of the milder version of that, which is just where one person goes, or one person or a small group of people or a large group of people end up interacting with another culture, and usually for a long period of time, like you would have to do for assimilation. And while they're immersed in that other culture, they don't necessarily let go of their entire culture, but they learn how things are done in the other culture. They change things. They, over time, become more like the other culture, although they might not have let go of their other culture entirely, or of their first culture entirely. So this could be, for example, if today I were to move to Italy, I'm sure over time I would become acculturated. I would start to speak Italian. I would start to understand their norms and their social customs, and I would adopt those. I would start eating more Italian food. Maybe I would marry an Italian. Well, I'm already married, so that would be bigamy, but I would marry an Italian, and I would learn the Italian family customs. So that's what we kind of mean by acculturation. I would still be a Canadian person, but I would, I'd become more Italian through that process of acculturation. Another way that cultures are dynamic is independent invention. So what that means is that there are things that have happened, inventions that have happened all over the world, where different cultural groups have come up with the same idea. So the big one would be agriculture. I think it was 7 times around the world, agriculture was independently invented in totally different spots. It wasn't, that the Incas were chit-chatting with the people in Mesopotamia who invented agriculture, but those two groups still both came up with agriculture. Globalization is kind of the big one, right? So we live in a super globalized world. It's just a fact of life. It really is. In the last at least 3 decades since the invention of the internet, but you can see how also things like social media would have sped it up. And certainly I'm sure that they've sped it up on a more interpersonal level, because we've been trading globally for a very long time. And so there's always been that dynamic globalization effect really just since we started trading with each other on a global scale, we haven't lived really in our own little individual cultural worlds. But certainly the advent of the internet has sped up the process of dynamic culture by globalization with regards to things like social media. And I'll skip to the next slide here because just as an example of how this has taken place, I'm filming this late enough because I couldn't get it to work before that I've seen that some of you have already posted on the course Discord page about the cultural appropriation assignment or the cultural appropriation prompt. And you've mentioned, you've shared that TikTok is where you've seen a lot of examples of cultural appropriation. And certainly some of the examples that you've shared have been where, you know, it's people on TikTok that are all from a dominant cultural group that are appropriating the culture of a marginalized group. But it also has just been happening on the internet. Like old grannies like me can remember Instagram. You know, you would see things from all over the world, and you might get recipe ideas from somebody living in Japan or in India. And all of that is part of cultural dynamism through the process of globalization. So I'm not going to get too far into what cultural appropriation is, but I will take this opportunity just to mention something because it's often a cultural talking point regarding cultural appropriation. A cultural talking point, I mean, not in the anthropological sense, but in the sense of our culture. So I think it's worth noting that a lot of times when you see articles like the article on cultural appropriation and Halloween that you read, where, you know, something like this will come out, or something will come out that a certain celebrity is being called out for cultural appropriation, for example, and there will be these naysayers on the idea of cultural appropriation who will say, well, culture always changes. Cultures have always borrowed from each other. Cultures will always steal things from each other. And it's absurd to pretend like this is some modern phenomenon and that people are suddenly just stealing from each other and that that's hurtful. But I think it's really important to distinguish between cultural dynamism as an idea and what cultural appropriation is in reality, and the fact that it can be harmful. It can be very harmful. So cultural dynamism, yeah, of course, humans have never lived in isolation. Even when you hear reports of an isolated tribe, like in isolation from whom? Because they know, like, you know, they're trading with other people, right? It's just that they're not perhaps as globalized as some other parts of the world, but there is no such thing as a culture that exists in isolation. And we have always been borrowing from each other. But cultural dynamism is one thing, and cultural appropriation is perhaps a subset of cultural dynamism that I think it's worth picking apart. Because just as one example, the author of the cultural appropriation and Halloween essay worked for a project called iPinch. And I don't remember what that stands for, but I do remember that it was a project out of SFU University in British Columbia. And it's something that I learned about in my undergraduate degree. And it's something that I found really helpful for conceptualizing what cultural appropriation is. So if you're still feeling a bit lost, I recommend looking at the iPinch Guide to Cultural Appropriation. It was specifically designed for creators and specifically designed for creators to avoid misappropriating Indigenous culture. And I remember in iPinch, they distinguish between cultural appropriation and cultural misappropriation. Cultural appropriation, misappropriation being harmful cultural appropriation. But you could make the same distinction between what the author says about cultural borrowing versus cultural appropriation. And so just because we can understand that people borrow from each other, people appropriate from each other, it still doesn't mean that not only that these things cannot be harmful, because they certainly can be, but also it doesn't mean that individual people in the world And people who are part of a dominant culture can't recognize that both things can be true and steer their own behavior in a certain direction. So I guess what I want to say is that cultural dynamism and cultural borrowing just doesn't mean that cultural appropriation is necessarily harmful or necessarily unharmful. And so to get into what we're talking about here, ethnocentrism. So you may or may not have already done the reading on this, but it basically means the belief or perception that your own culture is the superior culture. And it's also the inability to evaluate other cultures on the basis of your own norms and on the basis of their own norms and values, rather. So it's judging other cultural practices compared to your own culture because you have this inability to understand that different cultures operate differently, and that's fine. And other cultures can have their own norms and values about the same things. And just because you feel differently about somebody from another culture about something, it doesn't necessarily mean that your way of doing things is better. And yeah, so that's the end result of ethnocentrism, is that thinking that because something is different from what you're used to, that it necessarily means it's bad. But also I think about ethnocentrism that it's important to recognize that people who are really ethnocentric also have an inability to look at their own culture on the basis of its own norms and values, or at least in terms of thinking about it on the basis of its own norms and values. Because even things that could be potentially harmful or that could violate human rights about your own culture, you may be totally oblivious and totally uncritical, even though when you're looking at another culture, you're able to point the finger really easily and say, that's bad, that's harmful, that violates human rights. Meanwhile, your culture is like doing something that totally does the same thing. So what do we do about ethnocentrism as anthropologists? I would say that if I can boil it down for you, there are two tools that I would like to share that anthropologists use to combat ethnocentrism. And this isn't exhaustive, and it's actually like a super basic basic introduction, but one of them would be reflexivity and the other cultural relativity. So reflexivity means in its most basic terms to be reflective. Anthropologists use reflectivity when we're conducting research and writing our results up into ethnographies in order to avoid ethnocentrism and to really confront questions like, why am I doing this research? Or how do I fit into this community as an outsider and a researcher who's taking what I learned from these people to further my own career? Because especially if you're an anthropologist who, like me, is like white and pretty privileged, and especially if you're going in and you're studying like a marginalized group of people, but even if you're not, even just as a researcher, you kind of have an inherently powerful role in terms of whoever you're speaking with. When I conduct interviews with people who are certainly have more money than me, often have more privilege, it's just that, you know, I as a researcher kind of have a power to like conduct the conversation. Like they're looking to me in terms of like, what do you want? What do you want from me? And so as a researcher, you have this power. And so it's important to really reflect on like why you're doing this research and how you're doing this research and how could I be doing better with this research? And how can I give back if possible through this research, especially if you're working with communities of traditionally marginalized people. And one of the ways we do this, and I'm mentioning this mostly because you will probably hear me use these terms, but positionality refers to where an anthropologist stands in relation to their research topic and their research participants. So as I said, this is especially important in activist research and in research where there's a clear power imbalance between the researcher and the participants, but it's kind of hard to imagine a situation in which the researcher doesn't have, at least in some dimension, a little bit of power just inherently over their research participants. And really, we try to position ourselves within our research by being reflexive, by asking, why am I doing this? Who's benefiting from this? How can I change who's benefiting from this? And then our other term is cultural relativism. So in basic terms, as I've mentioned probably 5 times now, refers to the idea that we try to understand a culture or practice on its own terms. So when we look at a cultural practice, even one that we might think is harmful to individuals or violates human rights, even one that we might know is harmful to individuals or violates human rights, it's important to distinguish between like moral relativity and cultural relativity. So an individual researcher, because of what we talked about in terms of positionality, like anthropologists aren't expecting themselves, and they aren't expecting other anthropologists to go into a research question totally unbiased. We understand that you are an individual, you are a product of everything in your life that got you to be where you are today. And that is going to influence the way you think about things. People cannot be totally objective. People have biases. And then what we do as anthropologists about our biases is we try to be reflective. And so we can have all of this be true. We can think to yourselves, looking at a practice or something that you're studying, and think, this is really wrong. I cannot condone this as a researcher. I don't think this is the right thing, but this is really only one part of what it means to be culturally relative, right? There's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily matter so much whether you think this practice is reprehensible, because part of what cultural relativity, and you can think that, that's fine. But part of what cultural relativity means is that even if we don't agree with the practice, we still try to look at it on its own terms, in terms of its social and cultural context, to understand not only what is practice, because you'd be a pretty darn bad anthropologist if you just went in to a culture and you just wrote down, okay, yeah, this is what I think, everything's, yeah, okay, this is what it looks like people are doing here, and then you took off. Because really part of what it is understanding why it's practiced. So even if your research is activist in nature, like even if you're studying a cultural practice that you might be trying to stop, and that's kind of part of the aim of your research, you are never going to be able to do this without understanding why a certain cultural practice is done and engaging with the people in this culture through an understanding of their framework, of their way of life, of why it is that they're doing a particular thing. So just to give one example about this, Ebola. You may or may not be too young to really remember this, but back in 2014, there was a really serious epidemic of Ebola in Western Africa. So there were two anthropologists, Gogin and Bolton, who both conducted fieldwork in Western Africa. I don't think either of them were there while the epidemic was still going on, but they were there before and they were there after, and they maintained a continuity of the research in their communities. And then they co-published a study in 2017 that explored the reasons that two villages in Sierra Leone, literally 100 meters apart from each other, had such crazily disparate outcomes during the pandemic. So one village recorded 20 deaths out of 40 cases, and the other village had 0 cases. 100 meters apart from each other, and these are the disparities in outcomes that we're talking about. So how do we account for that? Well, Gogin and Bolton in their research discussed how basically it came down to public health practices and public health communications. And this, I know you are all familiar with, the idea of public health communications and like, how do we get people to do the thing that we want them to do for a public health purpose? And in Sierra Leone, in this particular area, part of what it came down to was a cultural illiteracy on the part of the people who were coming in and doing this public health work, because these two villages, they had no concept of germ theory. They didn't know what germs were, and they didn't have a word for germs. They didn't have a word for bacteria. The closest that they had was a word for maggots. And so some brilliant public health official decided to try to explain it to one of the chiefs of the villages as maggots cause Ebola. Now, I think the logic of why they decided to choose that word is probably evident, but the consequences of trying to choose that word and trying to use that word to explain what was happening backfired majorly. It caused at least one individual to essentially try to conduct an autopsy of somebody who had died of Ebola in order to see these maggots for himself, because everyone was like, maggots didn't cause this. Like, we would be able to see if maggots were what caused Ebola, we would see the maggots. And of course, they didn't see them. And I believe the person who conducted this autopsy ended up contracting Ebola. So yeah, not a good idea, right? But like, that's why from a cultural relativity perspective, you can't just go in from as an outsider and say like, no, what you're doing doesn't work here, and then try to explain things from your own cultural framework, because it doesn't work. It just doesn't. And that was the village, of course, that had the 40 cases. Now, public health with the other village, they started on perhaps an easier framework with the chief of the other village, because he was already, I believe he already had some proficiency in English, and he already kind of was like into Western culture a little bit, or Western culture, but like European American culture interested him. And so he was a little bit more open to talking with them. But really, they didn't tell him anything about Ebola. They didn't try to impose their own cultural framework. What they really just said is like, people are sick, and here, as a leader, this is what we want you to do in order to help the people of your village from getting sick. And they approached him on much more of a level that, you know, that worked, right? Because they were coming to him on his own terms, rather than trying to impose this whole idea of like, well, like, we don't really know any other way to explain it besides germ theory, but they don't have germ theory. So rather than trying to explain what they do have and asking about that and trying to understand like what they do, how they do understand disease, they just told them that maggots caused Ebola and it was a disaster. So this is like what I'm talking about when I say that cultural relativism is really important, and you're not going to get anywhere ever on any issue if you're just talking from your own position at other people who have a totally different position. So just a couple other examples that I'm going to give you before the Discord prompt on things that you may have experienced, or I tried to pick things that probably you have some sense of how, like, where the two or more sides are on this issue of cultural relativism versus ethnocentrism. So here are some examples of kind of areas where there tends to be a little bit of friction with regards to ethnocentrism versus cultural relativism. So one would be modesty norms for women. By that, I mean the idea that women should be covering up their bodies and showing much less skin, versus the idea that it's totally fine and totally normal to show lots of skin. And this really, I've heard this kind of, maybe it's because I watch too much 90 Day Fiancé, but I feel this is often thought of as a two-sides issue, but it's actually really not. And there are many different ways that you could get into across the world where you would be in a total disagreement over modesty. And it's not necessarily just when it comes to covering up or not covering up. Just as an example, I have a friend who worked in a hospital in Africa, and I forget where in Africa, which, so this is really out of context, but he told me that at the hospital where he worked, where there was a lot of like volunteers from Canada and the United States, that it was like totally normal in the rural area where he worked for like women to be completely bare-breasted. But then in the hospital, his coworkers often would just wear like jeans casually, and there was this idea that jeans were really immodest, and he had a lot of culture shock around that, not only around his framework of like modesty being that breasts should be covered up, but also that jeans were in some way immodest. So this is kind of an example where you could be from a lot of different places in the world, travel to another place in the world, and what is the cultural norm about how women should dress and how women should cover their bodies is really different. Public breastfeeding is another one, and I chose that because it's quite obvious. Like, I'm sure that whatever side, you know, you were raised on this issue, you know, it's not hard to find people who either are going to like throw hands in public over a woman breastfeeding her child, or who are going to like throw hands with that person because it's totally normal. So that's another one where there tend to be like really big cultural clashes over it, and both sides, you know, of that issue in the United States, at least. I'm sure there are other global norms that exist on this issue, but you know, it is an issue of ethnocentrism, both that people would say, oh, I can't believe you're breastfeeding your baby in public, and that other people would say, oh, I can't believe, like, that's so disgusting that you are at your own house and you have to go into your bedroom to breastfeed. That's just that's what I'm talking about here. And then eating habits, particularly with regards to meat, like that's huge. So, you know, I grew up eating so much meat. My parents are like carnivore diet, bulletproof people. Well, they're not carnivore diet, but they were like, they did paleo and all these things. So I grew up like totally thinking meat is like, you know, it's good for you, basically. And my parents are a lot more extreme. Like they're like, oh, vegetarians, like you need to eat meat to survive. But then there are total like entire societies and cultures in the world that are vegetarian, and they would think that it is super disgusting to eat meat. They'd be like, how could you do that? Like, you see what I mean? This is so, you know, either side is capable of being ethnocentric towards the other side. And so what I would like you to do is see if you can come up with an example of an issue like the ones that I just presented to you, where different cultures, and think outside of the box here, because different cultures, I don't necessarily mean cultures like American culture versus like Moroccan culture. I mean, like, they could even be different cultures that exist within the United States. They could be different subcultures. They could be different countercultures. So can you think of a time where you know of different cultures disagreeing on a particular issue, and where both sides can be ethnocentric towards the other without necessarily thinking about it, unless they're coming at it from a framework of cultural relativism? And please put your example, I don't know, I'm tapping like it's a YouTube video. Please put your example on #critical_thinking in the Discord channel. And thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to the semester. Bye.